No hires from low-level rural areas. If anyone hires them, I'd love to see that. As the interviewer, Mr. Smith, mocked me with these words, I was filled with anger. After laughing at my reaction, he pushed my resume into the trash can in the hallway. Unable to contain my fury, it exploded. "Then let me show you!" Saying this, I took out my mobile phone and made a call. The person on the phone answered immediately. While keeping eye contact with the interviewer, I called out to the person on the other end. "Dad, the interviewer is asking for you." Unexpected it was. Mr. Smith, with his bonehead voice raised, I smiled triumphantly at him. Now, the counterattack begins. My name is Hazel Taylor, a 63-year-old housewife. After marriage and childbirth, I retired at the age of 55. I was enjoying my time playing with my early-born grandchild. But before my 60th birthday, my husband, Adam, was found to have cancer. Adam, 3 years older than me, had just decided to retire, and we were planning to enjoy our retirement together. The discovered cancer was already in its final stages. Adam tried his best, but he passed away less than a year after its discovery. In shock and in a daze, my children and my father, Robert, conducted a funeral on my behalf. After retiring, Dad returned to our hometown in California and continued our family's grape farming business. Mom had passed away a little earlier, so Dad was running the vineyard alone. Although it was a small-scale operation, the grapes were of fine quality and traded at high prices. Dad's life was stable. Moreover, his daily dedication to the grapes seemed to have a positive effect. He looked much younger than his peers. Seeing Dad like this, I started to think that I shouldn't be down forever. So I decided to reapply for a job. Fortunately, having a CPA qualification made it easier for me to find work despite my age. Though Adam's inheritance was enough for living, I applied for an office job at a large corporation, something I had always wanted to try. I passed the document screening. The recruitment age was close to the upper limit, but my qualification must have worked, as my son and I were delighted. Then I received a letter for an interview at the headquarters, and I headed there. Most people at the interview venue were younger than me. Seeing them, I wasn't sure if I would be accepted, but I decided to go for it anyway. I noticed the older applicants looked downcast as they left the room, but I told myself it was just my imagination and knocked on the interview room door. "Come in!" In the interview room, one man was lounging with his arms and elbows on the table, and another sat upright with a computer in front of him. I tried to speak as loudly as I could, despite my nervousness. "Thank you for this interview opportunity. My name is Hazel Taylor. I look forward to speaking with you today." Yeah, sit down." The man who seemed to be the boss, without looking at me, said so. I thought him rude, but reconsidered it might be a stress interview and quietly took my seat. "All right, let's start the interview. Mr. Smith and I, Johnson, will be conducting it. Please, go ahead." Mr. Johnson, who seemed a bit unsure of himself, said this and extended his hand for a handshake. On the other hand, Mr. Smith, next to him, was still lounging and looking at me. "It's just an old lady." "Hey, Mr. Smith, I'm so sorry." After scrutinizing me from head to toe, Mr. Smith muttered something disrespectful in a low voice. Mr. Johnson hurriedly intervened and apologized, but Mr. Smith didn't seem to care. "So, old lady, let's hear a name and a brief career history." "Mr. Smith, that's rude." As Mr. Smith sneered at me with a nasty smile, my anger grew, but I thought this might just be a stress interview. So I decided to answer. "I am Hazel Taylor, 63 years old, I graduated from a 4-year university and worked in administrative roles at a local company. I retired about 6 years ago, enjoying time with my grandchild and helping with simple tasks at my family home. After losing my husband last year, I deeply wanted to work again, which led me to apply here. Mr. Smith looked at me with a clearly dissatisfied gaze. Then he picked up the resume I had sent for the first round, shook it, and threw it on the floor. We're not so free here to entertain a granny's pastime. Mr. Johnson quickly picked up my resume and apologized, but I was struggling to contain my growing anger. Mr. Smith seemed not to care at all, laughing and mocking me. Even if you graduated from a university, that was decades ago, wasn't it? A young, beautiful woman could brighten up the office. But that's impossible with a granny. You probably can't even use a computer, right? I can use a computer, I retorted, feeling irked, and Mr. Smith glared at me. He must have been really annoyed, even taunting at me. Mr. Johnson sat there, shrinking beside Mr. Smith, clearly showing the power of dynamic between them. A granny on a computer is not just about turning it on. You're not confusing it with a typewriter, are you? It's embarrassing to be so stubborn at your age. I've used computers for accounting and data entry at my previous job and at home. I can handle basic tasks. Mr. Smith seemed displeased with my responses, getting more irritated every time I answered. Don't you think this is what they mean by, okay, boomer? I'm not sure what you mean. I don't understand that reference. Unable to hold back any longer, Mr. Smith slammed the table with a loud bang. Silence filled the room. After a moment, Mr. Smith sat back down with a dry laugh and smiled kindly. Sorry about that. Got a bit carried away. Now, please tell us why you're interested in this position. Had he abandoned the stress interview approach? Confused by his sudden change of demeanor, I took a breath and answered. As I mentioned earlier, my husband's passing last year left me with more time alone. I wanted to be involved in the business beyond the grapes harvested at my father's vineyard. Your father runs a vineyard? I see. Mr. Johnson seemed genuinely interested, and a pleasant atmosphere began to fill the room. But Mr. Smith quickly shattered that mood. A vineyard? That's just some countryside stuff. What a blank this is. Suddenly, Mr. Smith burst out laughing. He laughed alone until he was satisfied and then swiftly moved to the door. That's it for the interview. You may leave now. Huh? Confused, I watched as Mr. Smith, smiling and pleasantly, opened the door for me. I reluctantly stepped outside. Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson followed me out. I formally thanked them for the interview, though it was just a formality. Then Mr. Smith snorted and said, Normally we'd send the results by May later, but you're not even worth that effort. I'll announce the results specially for you. Pointing at me, Mr. Smith raised his voice. No hires from low-level rural areas. If anyone hires them, I'd love to see that. Filled with anger at Mr. Smith's mocking words as he looked at me, I couldn't hold back any longer. He laughed at my reaction and shoved my resume into the trash can in the hallway. Unable to contain my fury, it exploded. Then let me show you. Saying this, I took out my mobile phone and made a call. The person on the phone answered immediately. While keeping eye contact with the interviewer, I called out to the person on the other end. Dad, the interviewer is asking for you. What? It must have been unexpected, facing Mr. Smith, who let out a bone-headed voice, I smiled triumphantly. The counterattack begins. Granny, did you really bring your dad along for this? As Mr. Smith laughed, I saw Dad walking up behind me. Mr. Johnson, noticing Dad, turned to him and bowed. Mr. Taylor, thank you for everything as always. What brings you here today? Ignoring Mr. Johnson's greeting in mid-sentence, Dad stood beside me. Mr. Smith, not understanding the situation, tilted his head, while Mr. Johnson turned pale upon realization. My daughter has been under your care. Ah, you're her father. Did you really just walk into our company? That's not okay. This is what happens with country bumpkins. Mr. Smith began to ridicule not just me, but also my dad. Then Mr. Johnson hastily apologized to Dad. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were Mr. Taylor's daughter. Hey, Mr. Johnson, why are you apologizing to this old man? You really are clueless. Mr. Smith was oblivious to the situation, while Mr. Johnson became paler by the moment. Then, a man approached from the direction Dad came from. What's going on here? Ah, Mr. Miller, good day to you. Just teaching her about the world. She brought her father to the interview. Mr. Smith bragged to Mr. Miller, the president, who looked displeased. Unaware, Mr. Smith pointed at me and continued proudly. We can't hire someone so delusional at her age. Before I could react to Mr. Smith's words, the president spoke. The one who's mistaken is you. What? Mr. Smith looked confused at the president's words. This man is Mr. Taylor, who supplies our highest quality wine grapes. Thanks to her father, our company has been producing top quality wine since its establishment. Don't you know this? Being in sales? Oh, that's Mr. Taylor! Mr. Smith exclaimed in surprise. As I tilted my head in confusion, Mr. Johnson whispered to me, Your father's grapes are top-notch, used in our most expensive wine. Everyone in sales knows how close he is to our president. Surprised by this new information, I realized how valuable Dad's grapes were. I knew they were delicious and traded at a high price, but I didn't realize their true worth. Mr. President, my daughter wanted to learn about the distribution process after our grapes are harvested, so I told her about this job opening. We had a dinner appointment after her interview, so I was nearby. I always thought highly of your company and have been in good terms with it. But it seems I was mistaken. I'll have to reconsider our future dealings. Mr. Taylor, I'm terribly sorry. This man has been extremely disrespectful, but our company isn't just filled with fools like him. Please, reconsider. Desperate, the president apologized beside Mr. Smith, who had turned from pale blue to white. He hadn't expected his actions to put his company in jeopardy, but then, remembering my presence, he turned to me fiercely. Why didn't you tell me who you were at the start? It's obvious. I didn't want to use my dad's connections. I wanted to be judged on my own merits, especially with my accounting experience and qualifications. Mr. Smith gritted his teeth in frustration. His unrepentant stubbornness was almost admirable. Then Mr. Smith desperately clung on. Then it's okay for me to reject her based on her age and such, right? Using your father like this is unfair, isn't it? Everyone was stunned into silence. Mr. Smith alone seemed to think he had won the argument. I sighed deeply before responding. No, I sought Dad's help because I thought your attitude was unjust. From the moment I entered, you were lounging with your elbows on the table, not even greeting properly. You ridiculed my responses and age, And you demeaned women's worth to just their looks. And finally, you abruptly ended the interview and threw my resume in the trash can. I did not do such things. Mr. Smith hurriedly denied it, feeling the president's increasingly cold gaze. Reluctantly, I reached into the trash can in the hallway, pulled out the crumpled paper, and handed it to the president. What is this? That is, Mr. Smith tried to snatch the paper back from the president's hand, but stopped at his stern glare. Frozen like a rabbit in the headlights, Mr. Smith watched as the president unfolded the paper. This is a resume. Yes, he crumpled up my resume and threw it away. At my words, the president widened his eyes and glared at Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, with no escape, was visibly shaking. I hope you haven't conducted similar interviews with other applicants today. No, not at all. I was just a bit irritated with Miss Taylor. I'm very sorry. Mr. Smith apologized. But I highly doubted that he had conducted proper interviews with others. Dad and the president seemed to share my skepticism, casting doubtful glances at Mr. Smith. All applicants interviewed today received the same treatment as Miss Taylor. A clear voice echoed in the previously silent hallway. Mr. Smith looked at the speaker in disbelief. Is that true? Yes, it's true. I have recorded it. The speaker, holding out an icy recorder, was Mr. Johnson, shaking slightly, but with eyes fixed firmly on the president. Mr. Smith, face red, tried to snatch the recorder from Mr. Johnson. Give it here! Do you want to be hurt like always? No, I won't give it! Desperately protecting the recorder, Mr. Johnson crouched down. Mr. Smith moved to kick him. Stop! What are you doing? The president intervened. Mr. Smith, utterly confused, seemed to remember the situation. Oh, I mean, just now. What does just now mean? Have you always been treated like this? The president asked Mr. Johnson, who nodded emphatically. Mr. Smith looked utterly defeated. Since joining the company, Mr. Smith has been my supervisor, behaving oppressively, sometimes directly as seen today. Knowing I couldn't resist as a new employee, he pushed me to my limits every day. So when I learned that Mr. Smith would be the sole interviewer today, due to HR's absence, I saw my chance, Mr. Johnson said, pressing the recorder's play button. Mr. Smith's crude laughter filled the hallway from the recorder. The contents were unbearably cruel. Social failures like you shouldn't apply here. Not your place. You don't look useful. There were even more egregious comments, mocking applicants' work history, education, and specific remarks on their appearance. This is your voice, isn't it? Oh, well, Even now, Mr. Smith tried to escape, but the president raised his voice. I am asking, if this is your voice? Yes, it is. Mr. Smith answered reflexively, standing up straight. And then Mr. Smith slumped down, seemingly realizing there was no escape. The president glanced at Mr. Smith before turning to Dad and me to apologize again. I'm truly sorry for the unpleasant experience. Appropriate action will be taken against this individual. I'll personally apologize to the other interviewees later. I think that's a good idea. I've always known you to be an excellent manager from our past dealings, so if you handle this situation properly, we'll continue our business with you. Dad nodded in agreement. Relieved at the continuation of business, the president turned to Mr. Johnson, took the recorder, and immediately made a call. Hello? Yes, it's me. Can you come here? Wait in front of the interview room. 2 minutes after hanging up, A man rushed over. The president explained the situation and pointed at Mr. Smith. The man nodded, forcibly made Mr. Smith stand up, gave us a brief nod, and dragged Mr. Smith away. That was the sales manager. I asked him to take Mr. Smith away with the evidence. Mr. Johnson, thank you for your courage in speaking up. I hope you continue to work with us. I'd be happy to. I was originally impressed by the company's management philosophy. Mr. Johnson's words made the president smile. After Mr. Johnson left, the president guided us to his office. I'll inform Mr. Taylor as soon as the decision about Mr. Smith's fate is finalized. It'll either be a transfer to an isolated district or dismissal. At least, he won't be interacting with Mr. Taylor anymore. Thank you. Dad seemed a bit relieved. The president also appeared relieved at not losing a vital business connection. Then he turned to me and apologized again. Hazel, I'm truly sorry. No amount of apologies can make up for the discomfort you experienced. It's okay. As long as that interviewer is punished, I don't mind anymore. At my response, the president thanked me and apologized again, which I quickly tried to stop. It felt uncomfortable to have someone older repeatedly apologize to me. Dad, sensing my discomfort, broached a new topic. So will Hazel and the others get another chance at the interview? If they wish, after apologizing, we'll conduct the interviews again. This time, I'll join as well. What do you think, Hazel? I declined the president's offer. Understood, was all he said. Dad and I then stood up and left the president's office. Later, the president informed us that Mr. Smith was transferred to an isolated district. Initially, he thought of firing him, but after hearing from Mr. Johnson about Mr. Smith's temperament, he feared he might irrationally harm me. To keep track of his movements, they sent him to a sales office in an isolated district where trusted personnel were present. Apparently, Mr. Smith had no intention of leaving the large corporation and accepted the transfer, quietly working in desk jobs. Though Mr. Smith became a useless employee, further investigation in the sales department revealed his tyranny towards others, not just Mr. Johnson. His previous accomplishments were found to be stolen from colleagues, proving he was always ineffective. Furthermore, it seemed he was married, but his wife divorced him following the transfer. One can only imagine he must have been just as tyrannical at home. It seems Mr. Smith was also having an affair and had to pay a significant amount in compensation due to the divorce lawsuit, which he complained about. The reason he forcibly became an interviewer that day was that he feared competent new hires would expose his incompetence, affecting his evaluation. So he planned to hire incapable people. He apparently took out his stress on applicants with better education and work history, pointing out their faults. I was just dumbfounded when I heard this. By the way, Mr. Johnson was promoted afterward. His ability to handle Mr. Smith's unreasonable demands was outstanding. And once it was discovered that the achievements Mr. Smith had claimed were actually Mr. Johnson's, his evaluation skyrocketed. Now he is considered a young, hopeful talent in the sales department. When Mr. Johnson visited me, he was no longer the timid person he once was, but a confident, upstanding young man. As for me, I eventually gave up on re-entering the corporate world and decided to help out at Dad's vineyard. I let Dad focus solely on growing the grapes and took over all other administrative tasks. There's a lot to learn about managing a business, and every day is a study, but I'm working hard to share Dad's beloved grapes with more people. It's challenging, but I've found a new purpose in life, and I'm filled with motivation every day. Recently, my son and his wife moved to our area. Surprisingly, my daughter-in-law expressed interest in taking over the vineyard. My grandson loves grapes and says he wants to become a grape farmer when he grows up. Carrying the dreams of my family, I am energized to keep delivering our grapes to many more people.